Okay, so today is October 7th, 2017. And we'll start with the homage to the Buddha 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so in this class we've been working our way through the first chapter in the Anguttara Nikaya called the Ekaka-nipāta, that's the Book of Ones. And we are in the midst of a long series of very short suttas, which are all developed according to a particular pattern. We have to go back to the first sutta in the series to see the pattern. So it's showing how a monk is one who is not devoid of jhana or not devoid of meditation, one who acts upon the teaching of the teacher, that is the Buddha, who responds to his advice and who does not eat the country's alms food in vain. So this is the template for the series of suttas. And then what differentiates each sutta is what the monk has to do to be qualified for that description. And so we started off with the 4 jhanas, then the 4 brahmaviharas or immeasurable states, and then through a whole other series, the 37 bodhipakkhiyas or aids to enlightenment. And now, the last time we finished with the 10 kasinas. Now we come to another series, a series of 10 terms. These are 10 contemplations. They're actually called, the Pali uses the word sanya, perception. And we find these also presented as a group in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Tens, where the 10 sanyas or perceptions are all grouped together. Every time I open this version of Word, I get this message: do you want to load the template, the normal .com template? And each time I think, I click no, and then I lose my formatting of all of the Pali accented characters and have to start over and do it again. Anyway, fortunately this time I have the word sanya here. So these are called 10 sanyas. Normally the word sanya is translated as perception. So usually we have perception as perception of visible forms, perception of sounds, perception of odors, taste, tactile objects, and ideas. But here the word perception is being used with a somewhat different nuance, more like you call meditative contemplations or themes for contemplation. And so here we have these 10 perceptions, 10 contemplations laid out as a set, starting from the perception of unattractiveness down to the perception of cessation. And it said in this sutta, the Buddha says that when these 10 perceptions are developed and cultivated, bhavita bahulikata, they are of great fruit and benefit, that they culminate in the deathless. The deathless is nibbana, that they have their consummation in the deathless. Okay, so to explicate them, I've taken in most cases, suttas, which give the standard formula for each of these 10 perceptions or 10 contemplations. So the first of these is called the perception, here it's translated the perception of unattractiveness. In Pali, it's a subha sanya, and the word subha usually means what is beautiful. And so asubha is the negation of that, what is not beautiful. But it's not referring to things like, we could say this microphone, is it beautiful? No, it's just plain, ordinary, piece of machinery. This mouse, is it beautiful? You could say not beautiful, but it's not asubha. So asubha is really indicating something that's more than just the absence of beauty. Often, the old translators would translate it as the asubha as foulness or loathsomeness, which maybe are too strong, but it's referring to the nature of the body, the physical body, with the idea that the physical body is not beautiful, because it's really, when examined closely and carefully, it turns out to be unattractive, repulsive, full of impure or unattractive constituents, components. And so here we have a passage from the famous sutta called the Girimananda Sutta, in which the Buddha is expounding on 10 sanyas, 10 perceptions. And one of these is the perception of asubha, which here I translated unattractiveness. And so how is this perception of unattractiveness to be practiced and developed? So here, the Buddha says, a monk, or really anybody who wants to practice this, examines this body, their own physical body, starting from the soles of the feet, first taking it in a global sort of sweep from the soles of the feet upwards to the tips of the hairs, then going downwards from the tips of the hairs, sweeping over the body, down to the soles of the feet, and then seeing it as enclosed in skin, bounded by skin. And then one sees it as full of many kinds of asuchino, this is impure components. Not morally impure, but we could say repulsive or unattractive components. And so the purpose of this particular perception or meditation is to counteract sensual lust, particularly sexual desire. And we have to remember that the Buddha was teaching a monastic order, a sangha consisting of monks and nuns, and many of them would have been young, in their teens, the novices in their teens, young monks in their 20s, early 30s, when that's the age when the sexual desire is quite strong. So it can persist even into old people. But especially for younger people, this meditation becomes very, very helpful as a means to counteract, to reduce sensual desire, sexual desire. Because what happens, the sexual desire arises because one grasps the appearance of the body, we say one grasps the appearance of the body, the external appearance of the body, taking that perception, the perception of the body as a whole. There's an expression for this in Pali. Gaha. Gaha is grip or grasp. You could see how it's related to the English word grasp. In Sanskrit it would be graha, so it's a little clearer in Sanskrit. So it's the grasp of things in their compactness, or in their taking things as a whole, not looking into them, analytically, distinguishing them by way of their components or their constituents. And so when one grasps the appearance of the body as a whole, then it can appear beautiful and attractive. A young monk looks at the young girl who comes out to offer alms on his alms round, and he sees a nice shape, pleasant smile, sparkling eyes, nice movements with the hands and the legs, and then the desire arises. And so as the antidote to that, the means to reduce, to overcome and reduce that desire, one starts looking at the body. But at the beginning, it wouldn't be wise. The young monk sees the young girl on his alms round. It wouldn't be wise for him to take the young girl as his object of contemplation, because then he starts off, okay, I'm going to practice the perception of the foulness of her body. And then he starts off, hairs of the head. Oh, those curls were so nice, so sweet. And then he moves from, instead of going on to the hairs of the body, he goes from the hairs of the head. The curls were so nice. Then her smile was so bright. And that sort of flash in her eyes when she looked up at me. And so then he's gone. So instead, the Buddha says in Pali, imang eva kayam, which means this very body, one's own body. So one has to work with one's own body at the outset. And so then one starts taking this body in terms of the constituents, the components. And so we have traditionally 32 parts of the body. The old texts, the Nikaya texts, have only 31, but the later, somewhat later texts add the brain, so we get an even 32. And so we have 20 parts which are considered, solid or material parts, and 12 parts that are considered liquid or fluids. Those of you who come to the Saturday class regularly, and you came in August, we did a whole day meditation on this. So the traditional way is to break these down into different groups. Yeah, I do it a little different from the Visuddhimagga. Okay, so we break them down into groups, and then one goes through the groups, focusing on each component. It said in the Visuddhimagga, it gives very complicated instructions for this. So you have to learn how to memorize the parts, going forward and backward. One has to get familiar with them. Of course, in practical terms, the question is, how do you get familiar with these parts like kidneys, spleen, mesentery? Unless you're a medical student, you don't know them. But one of the great advantages of the internet is that you can find almost anything you want. Bad things and good things on the internet. Whoops. Oh, those are the Buddha images. Yeah, you have like anatomical charts. So you could learn them through the anatomical charts. Brain, more internal organs, skeleton. Actually, this shows all of them together. Skeleton, the internal organs, the flesh, it's the muscles, skeleton, skin. This is the ligaments, the sinews. But there's a certain disadvantage in using the charts because the charts just don't have the vividness of the actual components. So the way we used to do it in Sri Lanka, because in Sri Lanka, back in those days, the 1980s, the doctor who was in charge of the mortuary, or we call the morgue, was a very devout Buddhist. I even remember his name, Dr. Salgado. And so we used to go some of the monks, we used to go to the mortuary and we would meet Dr. Salgado and say, can we be present when you do a autopsy? And so then he would say yes, and he would be very, very helpful. And when he brings out the body, it really looks like a person is just lying flat asleep. But then he takes his scalpel and starts cutting it open through the skin, through the muscle, uses some other instruments to pull it open. And then he knows, what are the parts that we want to know to get familiar with. So we'll pull out, like, this is the heart. These are the lungs. Wow, we could tell, from looking at the lungs, who was a smoker and who wasn't. And then he'll reach deep in and pull out the intestines. Becomes sort of almost like jumping out from the abdomen. These are the intestines. And then the big challenge is the brain. So he'll take this, they call it a hacksaw. It looks like a little rectangle with one edge as a blade. He'll first cut through the top of the head, then take the hacksaw and saw through the skull and crack it open and pull out the brain. And I remember one time I went with this very strongly built British monk who had walked on Charika, just walking without any fixed residence, stopping for the night wherever he would find himself. He had walked over a large area of Sri Lanka, very tough, rugged guy. And we went together to witness this autopsy. And I was watching it quite fascinated, but the strong, tough, young monk and turned to the doctor and said, do you have a chair? I'm feeling a little faint. is the doctor, not the monks, the doctor's wife came in wearing a lot of makeup. And then she said, "Oh, the first time you see it, it's quite shocking, but when you see it many times, you get used to it." Okay, so usually the way one practices this systematically is to go through the groups first in front forward order, like hair of the head, hair of the body, nails, teeth, skin, then goes back from skin to the hairs of the head, then going forward again from hairs of the head to the skin, but then passing on to the next group. Here we have flesh. I stop at bone marrow, because the Visuddhimagga puts kidneys in there, but that doesn't seem so logical to me, because these are all seem to go together naturally, getting internal, but not yet coming to the actual organs. So here we just have 4. I go from flesh to bone marrow, back to flesh, then from flesh through bone marrow, then going into kidneys, up to lungs, lungs back to kidneys, from kidneys to lungs again, then from intestines up to brain, and back to intestines, up again to brain. Then I put a double bar here, because now with this move, or with this step, we move from the so-called solid parts, or more substantial parts, to the fluids of the body, from bile up to fat, fat to bile, bile to fat, then through to grease, up to urine, urine to, from tears up to urine, from urine back to tears, and then from tears up to urine again. And then one could start going back to the beginning and then working over and over and over until you get very familiar with these parts. And then the way that I find useful to practice this, because all of these parts won't be equally prominent in one's own understanding, in one's own perception. So after one tries to work through all of them, a number of the parts will stand out as more prominent. And so what I find useful to do is to just pull out or to select those parts that are most prominent and say a set of 5 and just work with those 5 that are most prominent. Okay, so this is the perception of the asubha sanya, the perception of the unattractive nature of the body. Okay, next comes the perception of death. And I couldn't find in the suttas though there are many themes relating to the idea of death, the perception of death, but they're sort of spread out and scattered here and there. So what I found useful, and this is the method that I've taught in our full-day retreat on the meditation on death, what I found the useful way to organize these themes is to have 3 main headings, or 3 main topics, each of which is subdivided into 3 minor topics, or 3 aspects to each main topic. So the 3 main topics is the fact that death is absolutely certain, unavoidable, inevitable, inescapable. Then the fact that the arrival of death is absolutely unpredictable, unforeseeable. And the third main theme is that when death comes, we have to go on leaving behind everything. And then to take the subtopics under the theme that death is absolutely inevitable or certain, one way to approach this is through the idea that everyone who has ever lived before has died, going back to, you could go back to prehistoric human beings, all gone, only their fossils remain. Ancient times, through medieval times, to modern times, just to the previous generation, all have gone. Even maybe our parents are still alive, but our grandparents, or at least our great-grandparents, have passed away. And so when we think of that, then I can't be an exception. It won't be the case that I'm still around, 3 or 4 generations down the road. So I too am bound to die. Okay, so that's one way to approach the meditation on death. The second way, the second sub-theme, is that death comes along together with birth. And so the moment that I'm born, even the moment that I'm conceived in the womb, but let's just take the moment that I've come out of the womb, that I'm born, death is already there. It's sort of just out of sight, sort of like hanging around over my left shoulder. Oh, this is my right shoulder. And it's just hanging around. The verse that we recite says it's like a murderer with a drawn sword, stalking behind me. I just turn around, trying to catch it. I don't see it, but it's there. And when conditions come together, it'll strike. Okay, so that is the second theme, that death comes along together with birth. It's just a package deal. If you're going to get life, you're going to get death. And then the third aspect or sub-theme is that I'm always moving from the moment of birth, moving constantly ever closer to death, to my own death. We really have to make it personal to arouse that samvega, that sense of urgency. So we might start off thinking, okay, every year I'm getting older and older, closer to death. Let alone every year, every month. No, not every month, every week. At least I have a week. But do I really have a week? Does the process of approaching death go just from week to week? How does it go? From day to day, right? Does it stop at the days? Hour to hour? Minute to minute? Second to second? Split second to split second? Heartbeat to heartbeat? Always getting closer. Okay, so that is 3 aspects that death is inevitable, inescapable, unavoidable. The second theme is that the arrival of death is absolutely uncertain. We don't know the time, whether it will be next year, 10 years from now, next month, next week, tomorrow, today. I mean, just this past week, we had this tragic event in Las Vegas. Those people went to the country music festival thinking we enjoy ourselves, and then maybe after the festival, we go out to a restaurant, and then this crazy murderer comes and just sprays them with bullets, and 59 people had no idea. Most of them, I saw the report, in their 20s and 30s. Okay, so the arrival of death, uncertain in regard to time, uncertain in regard to place, we don't know where we will be, uncertain as regard to cause, we don't know how we'll die. Okay, then the third main theme is when death comes, one must give up everything. So we have to give up our material possessions, including titles, honor, fame, and so forth. Second, we have to give up all of our loved ones, our dear relatives, friends, husband, wife, children, parents. And third, we have to give up, what's the third thing we have to give up? Material wealth, relatives and friends. What is the third thing? Right. This physical body. And even that sense of identity built on this physical body. Have to give that up. And then I add a fourth theme to this, that when death comes, the only thing we take that goes along, that follows us along, is this stream of consciousness together with its accumulated karma, the wholesome and unwholesome karma, and the different mental tendencies or dispositions that we've developed. Sort of the habit energies that we've been created. Okay, so this is the perception of death. Then we come to the third contemplation. This is called the perception of the repulsiveness of food. This is a useful one. The Visuddhimagga gives a very detailed explanation of this, treating it with 11, I think there were something like 10 or 11 aspects in which food is considered repulsive. But I find it could be sufficient just to take, I hope I'm not going to ruin anybody's lunch today. Okay, we have a plate of food or a bowl of food is put out. Of course, we have some steaming rice, nice, maybe basmati rice. It's the Indian rice with a very pungent flavor. And then we have maybe here some nice tofu, mapao, what's it called, mapao tofu? Malpo tofu, some nice greens, chingsai, and some various, maybe a friend Siu here has brought some Sri Lankan kiribat with the miri sambal, is that what it's called? That's the red pepper mix to eat with the kiribat. That's the rice cooked with coconut milk. Everything very delicious with a nice sweet and sour soup, a little dish of fruits put out. Okay, so now everything looks so lovely and delicious. Okay, now I take it, put it into the mouth, chew it up. Now I have a choice of doing two things. I could either swallow it, in which I don't get the sense of repulsiveness unless I sort of imagine, or I could take a little saucer and spit it out. Now I look at it, and somebody says, go on, you are going to swallow it. There's no difference really between that lump of chewed food you had in your mouth and this bowl of food that you just spit out. And when you look at it and reflect, no difference at all. So why do you swallow the mass of food in your mouth? Because you don't see it. But when you see it out on a plate, you don't want to swallow it. You say, take it away, get rid of it. Disgusting. Okay, so you could use that, just think that the food that I'm chewing, if I were to see it in front of me, I wouldn't want to swallow it. Okay, so that's one way to develop the sense of the repulsiveness of food. Okay, the perception of non-delight in the entire world, the expression is a bit strange, but we have a formula that comes in the same sutta, the Girimananda Sutta. So here the Buddha says, what is the perception of non-delight in the entire world? Here a monk refrains from any engagement or approach or involvement and clinging, mental standpoints, adherences, and underlying tendencies in regard to the world, abandoning them without clinging to them. And so the way the commentary explains this, that the way this engagement and clinging and all of this takes place is mainly through the work of two factors. One is craving, by which one sort of latches on to things out of desire, blind desire. And the other is in terms of views, formulating views, particularly the views of things as being permanent, pleasurable, and as being self, views of I and mine. And so when one wears out and gradually abandons that craving for the enjoyment of the six objects of the six senses, and gives up the distorted views about things in the world, then one is developing this perception of non-delight in the entire world. Okay, since the next three form a set or a group, maybe at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions on 1, 2, 3, the first four perceptions. Don't be shy. Okay, if there's no questions, then we go on. Okay, so now we have, as I said, these three, the next three form a group, and this is the group concerned particularly with the development of insight. And so this is the way insight proceeds through the three lakshanas, the three characteristics of phenomena, sometimes also called the three of the four dharma seals. So this is, we begin with the perception of impermanence, and then when one discerns or perceives that things are impermanent, then one moves to the perception of that whatever is impermanent is also dukkha. And though here we translate dukkha in the usual way as suffering, it doesn't mean that everything that's impermanent is actually painful, or tormenting, afflictive. But here the word dukkha has rather the nuance or the implication of being, I could use the word of being flawed or defective. Or unsatisfactory. Okay, and then in the third contemplation of the set, then one moves from the perception of dukkha, of the unsatisfactory nature of things, to the perception of non-self, anatta, in what is dukkha. Okay, then in order to elaborate on these perceptions, I took first some passages from the Girimananda Sutta. So here the Buddha explains what is the perception of impermanence. Then he says that the monk goes to the forest, to the foot of a tree, to an empty hut, and then reflects or examines thus. So form, feeling, perception, the volitional activities, consciousness. In other words, the 5 aggregates are seen to be impermanent. And then we have this okay, the 5 aggregates are said to be impermanent. Okay, then to move to the perception of suffering in the impermanent, I took a number of suttas from Anguttara Nikaya. So here we have the perception of suffering in the impermanent in regard to the 5 aggregates, as in the Girimananda Sutta. But also we have the same relationship of impermanence to dukkha can be applied to the 12 sense bases. So the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind are impermanent and therefore dukkha, and also the 6 kinds of objects: visible forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, mental objects are impermanent, therefore dukkha. And probably the reason why what is impermanent is considered to be dukkha is because what the human mind seeks, what it aspires for, is a permanent happiness. But if you're seeking happiness in what is impermanent, then eventually you're going to be disappointed. And so even when these objects of pleasure are present, if we see that they're going to change and to pass away, then we see that they can't be taken as bases for a stable, lasting happiness. And therefore, even when they're present, they're really defective or unsatisfactory. So therefore, what is impermanent is dukkha. Okay, then the third perception is the perception of non-self in what is dukkha. And so here one proceeds from the unsatisfactory nature of things to the perception of non-self. But actually the way it's laid out, the usual way it's laid out in the suttas, is that one goes through all 3 characteristics, from impermanence to dukkha, and then from dukkha to non-self, and then sort of to elaborate on the perception of non-self, one sees these things with correct wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And so here this is applied, but actually this should be applied to all 5 aggregates. And then here it's applied, the same template is applied to the 6 internal sense bases, from the eye to the mind base, and then here to the 6 external bases, from visible forms to the mental objects. sometimes strikes me as a bit puzzling, where the question arises, is it really necessary to go from impermanence to dukkha, and then from dukkha to non-self? Because it seems logically one can just go directly from impermanence to non-self. And in fact, there are some suttas, a few suttas in the Pali Canon, where the formula is laid out simply that material form, feeling, perception, sankharas, and consciousness are impermanent, therefore all conditioned things are impermanent, and then material form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness are non-self, all dharmas are non-self, and the characteristic of dukkha is omitted. Because one of the sort of underlying implications of the idea of atta, or atman, the self, is that it must be, should be permanent. It has to have some kind of permanence. So if one sees that any of these things is impermanent, then one also sees that ipso facto, it can't be taken as self. A good example of this actually is in the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 148, I believe. Let's see if we could find it. Okay, this is a good example. Don't worry, the Pali is not all that difficult here. I'll explain it. Okay, so here it begins that somebody might say that the I is self, but that is not tenable or not acceptable. And the reason is because an arising, upada, and a vanishing or passing away, vayo, of the I is perceived. And if for anything, if an arising and a passing away is perceived, then if you identify that as the self, then it would follow that myself arises and passes away. And does it make sense to say myself arises and passes away? Then, if I say Bhikkhu Bodhi has a real self, and that self has passed away, then who's sitting here talking? Right? So it doesn't make sense for anything that has a rising and passing away, and that's the mark of impermanence. So if anything is impermanent, then it follows it can't be self. Okay, but I think maybe the reason why the Buddha and the text usually go with three characteristics is because if there's a kind of clinging to things, like the five aggregates or the six sense bases, when we take them to be self, myself, we're clinging to them and holding to them. And so when we're holding to them, there's sort of an implicit belief that they are pleasurable or a source of happiness. So if it's pointed out that they're impermanent, and because they're impermanent, they're dukkha, unsatisfactory, then, or defective, and even a cause or an underlying ground of suffering, then one wants to let go of them. And so one stops identifying with them. So that is how one moves from impermanence to, or that is why the Buddha moves from impermanence to dukkha, and then from dukkha to non-self. Okay, so that takes care of these three contemplations or perceptions. Then we have 1, 2, 3 more. So we've done 4, 3. So the next is the perception of abandoning. And so what is the perception of abandoning? And it seems to me that this is not really so much the way it's explained, not so much a separate contemplation, but really something that one does in the course of any kind of meditation that one is practicing. Like even when practicing, say, mindfulness of breathing, what one has to do is to eliminate or get rid of or to abandon any kind of unwholesome thoughts that arise. So this is the explanation in the Girimananda Sutta. So what is the perception of abandoning? Here, a monk does not tolerate an arisen sensual thought of sensual pleasure, but he abandons it, dispels it, terminates it, obliterates it, gets rid of it. And so he does not tolerate an arisen thought of ill will or hatred, an arisen thought of harming, of violence or cruelty. So those are the three usual unwholesome thoughts. And those, when they arise, whether one is practicing mindfulness of breathing or maybe just practicing mindfulness or attention to bodily sensations, or even loving kindness meditation, these kind of thoughts arise, and when they arise, one gets rid of them. So I see this not so much as a separate meditation object, but rather a kind of adjunct to the other meditation objects. So first we have the three main unwholesome thoughts, and then there can be a whole variety of other unwholesome thoughts can arise. So whatever bad, unwholesome thoughts arise, one gets rid of them when they arise. So that is called the perception of abandoning. Okay, then the next is called the perception of dispassion. And here, dispassion or viraga is being used as a synonym for nibbana. But the perception of dispassion is not an actual meditative realization of nibbana. This is not the penetration of nibbana that comes when one develops insight up to the level of the world transcending, the lokuttara, chusha, jenda, paths and fruits. But rather this is more a meditative reflection or a meditative contemplation on the qualities of nibbana in order to make the mind calm and peaceful. And so what is the perception of dispassion? So here the monk goes to the foot of a tree and so forth, and he reflects. You see, it's a reflection. Thus, this is peaceful, this is sublime. That is the stilling of all sankharas. The sankharas could be understood as the activities of the mind, the mental activities. But another meaning of the sankharas are conditioned phenomena. So this expression can be understood in both ways. And I found actually that different commentaries explain it sometimes in one way, sometimes in the other way. Sometimes as the mental activities, or the volitional activities, sometimes as the conditioned phenomena. So it's the stilling or sabbasankara samato, the settling down, the tranquilizing of all activities. Then sabupadi patini sago, the giving up or relinquishing of all objects of attachment. Then it's the destruction of craving. And then here the word dispassion occurs. Viraga, and then the meaning of dispassion here, its reference, is spelled out with the final term, nibbana. So all of these expressions here, we could say, are designations or synonyms for nibbana. Okay, so that is the perception of dispassion. And then finally, we come to the perception of cessation. And this is also a meditative reflection or contemplation on nibbana. And the formula, you'll see, is exactly the same as the perception of dispassion. The only difference is that instead of using the word viraga, this one uses the word nirodha, cessation. And so you could also just combine them. In fact, I don't see why. I think maybe, because the suttas like to fill out having groups of 10. And so if you combine them, then you get only 9. And so it's broken up. Or you could also put them together, and then you get a more complete contemplation on nibbana. Okay, so that takes us through this group of 10 contemplations. Okay, so maybe at this point I should ask whether there's any questions. Oh, I see, okay, Alvina.
Does nirodha mean non-anger? Because
No, this is not krodha. Yeah, this is nirodha. That word is krodha, or in Pali it would be koda. That is anger. And the opposite of koda in Pali would be akoda, non-anger.
Bhante, then further to the discussion of the perception of non-delight in the entire world. Do things like righteousness also come under non-delight? Because some of those finer qualities which people, either it accumulates as karma, how do we look at that?
You mean like wholesome activities?
Wholesome activities, yeah.
Well, the idea here, I guess, would be that, of course, when one is being active, one engages in wholesome activities, but one doesn't become attached to them with craving, and one doesn't formulate views about them. So really what's being sort of knocked out here is the attachment through craving, or the attachment through craving and through views.
Thanks, man.
Okay, you're wrong?
Monday, because of the final two meditation that you mentioned here, it seems to me that all of them except for the three characteristics are meditation on the imaginary
Yeah.
quality.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah. All of these, let's get the whole set. Yeah, all of these involve, I would say, not direct perception, but sort of formulating, using intellectual activity or reflective activity to, say, develop certain wholesome qualities or a certain degree of renunciation, detachment. Yeah, so the perception of the unattractive nature of the body, even though one gets the perception direct, if one has the opportunity through looking at a corpse or looking at anatomical charts, but then one is using sort of the imagination to get the sense of the unattractive nature. And from a sort of philosophical standpoint, one would say that unattractiveness or asubha is not, how to put this, it's not a real characteristic of things, or a characteristic in the sense of something to be penetrated with insight, but it's rather a characteristic that's sort of brought to prominence for a pragmatic purpose of helping to reduce and to remove sensual desire. Similarly, the perception of death is something that one develops imaginatively. The repulsiveness of food, non-delight in the world. And as I said, perception of abandoning, it's more an activity than really a contemplation. And then these two, dispassion, cessation, also involve this intellectual or reflective activity. So it's only these three that belong to the sphere of insight. And the others are considered, all of these are considered modes of samatha meditation rather than vipassana or insight meditation. And also they're not the modes of samatha meditation that intrinsically lead to a strong degree of one-pointedness, except perhaps certain ways of practicing the unattractive nature of the body. But if one does with all 32 parts or a multiplicity of parts, it won't bring that strong, powerful, one-pointed samadhi. But there are ways of sort of deconditioning the mind from certain, deep dispositions and instilling 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, these 4, you could say, are intended to develop a certain disenchantment or disillusionment with the delights of the world. And then the last 2 are intended to develop an aspiration for liberation or for nibbana by highlighting the attractive aspects or the positive aspects of nibbana. Any further questions? Okay, so let us then just move from, we have this set of 10 contemplations, then we come to another set of 10 contemplations in which, lo and behold, this is interesting. Here we have the perception of impermanence. I didn't notice this last night when I was preparing. The perception of non-self, and the perception, 75, 76. Yeah, the perception of dukkha has dropped out here. So we're just going, and then it's not proceeding from the perception of impermanence to the perception of non-self. It's treating them as different perceptions. But of course, I think naturally, if one develops the perception of impermanence, then I think naturally the perception of dukkha will arise. And then from both, the perception of non-self will arise. Then we have 477, perception of death, perception of repulsiveness of food, perception of non-delight in the entire world. So these three, again, carry over from the previous set. Then we have the perception of the skeleton, the worm-infested corpse, the livid or bluish corpse, the perception of a fissured corpse that's been partly cut up, and then the perception of a bloated corpse. In the Visuddhimagga series, the bloated corpse would come first. These seem to be different ways of developing the perception of unattractiveness. So instead of using the parts of the living body, one now focuses upon the corpse in different stages of disintegration. Usually in the series, the skeleton, of course, will come at the end. Of course, when the rest of the body disappears, all that's left is the skeleton. And so in the Buddha's time, to practice any of these, to really practice them effectively, one would have to go to what they call the charnel ground, where they would cast off the corpses when the kings would kill criminals, or when beggars would die in the streets, rather than beggars without any known relatives. Instead of giving a proper funeral to them, they had an area where they just take the corpses and throw them away. And then monks would go there sort of very carefully and then observe the corpse in the particular stage of disintegration, get a clear mental idea of that corpse, and then use that as the object of meditation. Okay, so these are another set of 10 perceptions. Then we have the 10 kinds of recollection, or 10 kinds of mindfulness that we've already gone through these. We had the 10 of them in an earlier series in this chapter. Okay, then sort of to wrap up this part, we have an interesting section in which the 4 jhanas are said to be developed in association with first the 5 faculties and then the 5 powers. I think the purpose of this is to generate another set of 10, and then we'll have still another set of 10 down below with the 4 Brahmaviharas developed in the connection with the 5 faculties, and then the 5 powers. To me, this seems that these sets, my conjecture is that these were developed by the compilers of the suttas rather than coming directly from the Buddha himself, in order to create more sets of 10 to sort of expand the Anguttara Nikaya, to generate more suttas. And so we have let's just take the first jhana. So one develops it associated with faith. So this would be faith, out of faith in the triple gem, one develops the first jhana. Then of course to develop it, one needs energy. One needs the faculty of mindfulness, the faculty of concentration. What seems to be a bit problematic is the faculty of wisdom. Because in the faculty of wisdom, if we look in the Samyutta Nikaya, where it explains the 5 faculties, it said that the faculty of wisdom takes as its objects the 4 noble truths. And elsewhere we see that the faculty of wisdom is directed to the three characteristics: impermanence, dukkha, non-self. But in the first jhana, or the other jhanas, there's no contemplation of the Four Noble Truths, no contemplation of the three characteristics. Okay, but maybe just you could understand, to develop the first jhana, at least one needs the wisdom to know what are the obstacles to concentration, what are the aids or the factors that contribute to concentration, and how to balance the different spiritual faculties in order to achieve the first jhana. So all of that, you could say, is the work of wisdom. Okay, so we have the four jhanas developed in association with the five faculties, then with the five powers, the power of the power of faith, the power of energy, power of mindfulness, power of concentration, power of wisdom. And then it starts off with the first jhana, then it goes on to the second, third, and fourth jhana. Okay, then here we have also the five spiritual faculties accompanied by loving kindness, accompanied by compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity, and then that is also connected to the five powers. And that takes us to the end of this section. So now, to complete the chapter of ones in the Anguttara Nikaya, we just have this long section on mindfulness of the body, which we'll do next time. And then we're finished with the ones. When did we start this? About a year ago, I think. Almost a year ago. Okay, any questions? Okay, Tsering. Yeah, it's you. Yeah, I think, try it. I think it's on. Yeah. You have to. She'll turn it on for you. Yeah, now it's on.
The question is on the repulsiveness of the food.
Yeah.
In essence, when you eat, there is food. Of course, there is a certain amount of forms that we see.
I think you have to speak more loudly.
We see the forms,
Yeah.
and because that brings about certain, I guess, some ideas about how delicious it is.
Yeah.
And then the process of eating, then there's some delight in that.
Yeah.
But the food really as it is, I mean, so isn't it really the feelings that we really have to kind of observe? Is the food as is such is neutral? It's just that.
Yeah, actually, strictly speaking, the food itself is neutral, but it's not just the feelings, but it's the way the food is when you chew it up, and then when it gets mixed with saliva, and then the way it's further developed in the Visuddhimagga. You think that it goes down the throat, and the food collects in the stomach, then it gets mixed with the digestive juices, and then it becomes, this mass of substance which is not so pleasant. Then if we were to extend it further, we speak about what's the technical term? I don't remember. When it goes into from the stomach, it gets into the small intestines, then it gets further digested in the small intestines, then it gets pushed into the large intestines, and then the water gets drained off in the large intestine, and then the waste gets pushed down through the colon, accumulates in the retina, then it gets pushed out from the anus until you get the excreta. So those are different ways, the stages, and the reflection on the repulsiveness of food.
Thank you, Mati.
Any further questions? Okay, so we'll end for the day. Yeah, I won't have a Q&A section this afternoon, since there'll be a meditation retreat, and I think people want to get ready. So we'll end for the day here with the sharing of the merits. So we're going to share the merits with the devas, the deities, the nagas or dragon spirits, the bhutas, the fierce spirits, asking them to rejoice in these merits and to protect the Dharma and to protect living beings. Excuse me. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabbasampati siddhya etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabbasampati siddhya etavatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavagopadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibuting. Okay, next Saturday, we won't have a class because the meditation retreat continues through next Saturday. So the next class